He was born into such crushing poverty that, as a small child, he was sent to live in a workhouse. His mother lost her mind before his eyes. He couldn't read music, yet he composed the scores for his own films. He built one of the most recognizable characters in the history of entertainment without ever speaking a single word on screen. And at the height of his fame, the country that made him a legend turned around and threw him out. This is the complete story of Charlie Chaplin, the boy from the slums of London who became the most famous man on the planet. To understand just how remarkable Charlie Chaplin's rise really was, you have to start with just how far down he began. He was born Charles Spencer Chaplin on April 16, 1889, in the Walworth district of South London, into a world of music halls, cramped tenements, and grinding Victorian poverty. Both of his parents worked in the entertainment business. His father, Charles Chaplin Sr., was a singer and entertainer of modest success, and his mother, Hannah, performed under the stage name Lily Harley, singing and acting in the same music hall circuit. It should have been a household full of performance and creativity, and in some ways it was, but it was also deeply unstable. His father struggles with alcoholism throughout Charlie's early childhood, eventually abandoning the family, and dies at just 37 years old when Charlie is only 12, his body ravaged by drink. That leaves young Charlie, his older half-brother Sidney, and their mother Hannah to survive largely on her earnings alone, and for a while, Hannah's voice and stage presence are enough to keep the family fed. But her health, both physical and mental, begins to deteriorate. In one moment that Chaplin would describe decades later as one of the most formative of his entire life, his mother's voice cracks and fails mid-performance on stage when Charlie is only 5 years old. Rather than let the audience turn hostile, the theater manager pushes the young boy out onto the stage in her place, and Charlie, barely more than a toddler, sings a popular song of the day to a delighted crowd, who begin throwing coins onto the stage. It's his first real taste of performing, and it's also the first sign of a survival instinct that would define his entire life. When everything falls apart around you, you find a way to make the audience love you anyway. But Hannah's condition continues to worsen. She's eventually diagnosed with a psychiatric illness, later understood to likely be linked to malnutrition and syphilis contracted from Charlie's father, and is repeatedly committed to mental asylums throughout Charlie's childhood and adolescence. With no stable parent able to care for them, Charlie and Sidney are sent more than once to Lambeth Workhouse, and then to a school for impoverished and orphaned children called Hanwell. It's an almost Dickensian childhood in the most literal sense: hunger, institutional cruelty, watching his own mother slip in and out of sanity, moving between relatives, workhouses, and the streets of London whenever no other option was available. Chaplin later said that poverty taught him everything he needed to know about human dignity, and about the particular kind of humor that comes from people who have nothing left to lose. Performance becomes his escape, and eventually, his profession. As a boy, he joins a clog dancing troupe called the 8 Lancashire Lads, touring British music halls, and by his teenage years he's working steadily in professional theater, taking on small roles that showcase a natural gift for physical comedy, pratfalls, exaggerated expressions, perfectly timed slapstick. In 1908, still a teenager, he joins the prestigious Fred Carnot Comedy Theatrical Company, one of the top vaudeville and music hall troupes in Britain at the time, known for elaborate pantomime-based comedy sketches performed with almost no dialogue, training that would directly shape the visual, wordless comedic style that eventually makes him a global icon. It's with Carnot's troupe that Chaplin gets his ticket to America, touring the United States multiple times between 1910 and 1913, developing his stagecraft in front of American audiences who have never seen anything quite like him. It's during one of these American tours, in 1913, that Chaplin is spotted by a representative of Keystone Studios, one of the leading film production companies of the silent era, run by the legendary producer Max Sennett. Sennett offers Chaplin a contract, and in early 1914, Chaplin makes his first film appearance, stepping into the brand new medium of motion pictures at a moment when the entire industry is barely a couple decades old and still figuring out what it even is. It's during his very first year at Keystone that Chaplin creates the character who will define the rest of his life and, arguably, the entire history of cinema, the Tramp. Thrown together almost by accident, reportedly assembled out of whatever costume pieces were lying around, including Fatty Arbuckle's oversized trousers, a tiny too-small jacket, giant shoes worn on the wrong feet to make walking look comically difficult, a tiny bowler hat, and a simple toothbrush mustache chosen specifically because it was small enough not to obscure his facial expressions. The Tramp is an instant sensation. He's a shabby, penniless outsider who nonetheless carries himself with the manners and pretensions of a gentleman, forever getting into and stumbling gracefully out of trouble, endlessly kind to the vulnerable and endlessly defiant toward the powerful and the pompous. Audiences everywhere fall in love with him almost instantly, and within just a couple of years, Chaplin and the Tramp become the single biggest attraction in the entire, rapidly growing film industry. What follows over the next decade and a half is one of the most extraordinary rises in the history of entertainment. Chaplin quickly leverages his popularity to gain almost total creative control over his own work, an almost unheard-of level of authority for an actor at that point in film history. He moves from Keystone to SNA, then to Mutual, then to First National, each contract bigger and more lucrative than the last, until finally in 1919 he does something even more audacious. Alongside fellow legends Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and director D.W. Griffith, he co-founds United Artists, a studio built specifically to give its filmmaker owners full creative and financial control over their own work, free from the constraints of the traditional studio system. By this point, Chaplin isn't just an actor. He's writing his own screenplays, directing his own films, editing them himself, and remarkably, composing the musical scores for his films despite having no formal training in music theory or notation. He would simply hum or whistle melodies to trained composers, who would transcribe and arrange them into finished scores under his close direction. Across the 1920s and into the early 1930s, Chaplin produces the run of films that cement his legacy as one of the greatest filmmakers who ever lived. The Kid, released in 1921, blends his trademark slapstick comedy with genuine emotional depth, drawing heavily on his own impoverished childhood to tell the story of the tramp raising an abandoned orphan boy. A film that shows audiences, for the first time, that Chaplin's comedy could carry real pathos alongside the laughs. The Gold Rush, from 1925, follows the tramp through the brutal conditions of the Klondike Gold Rush, and includes what's still considered one of the greatest comedic sequences ever filmed, in which the starving tramp cooks and eats his own boot as though it were a gourmet meal. City Lights, released in 1931, tells the story of the tramp falling in love with a blind flower girl and going to extraordinary lengths to help restore her sight, remarkable not just for its emotional power, but for the fact that Chaplin released it as an essentially silent film years after the rest of Hollywood had already fully converted to synchronized sound, a decision many in the industry considered commercial suicide at the time. Chaplin believed, deeply and stubbornly, that pantomime was a universal language, capable of communicating across every culture and every spoken language on Earth without a single word of translation needed. And City Lights proves him right, becoming both a critical and commercial triumph. He holds onto that conviction for as long as he possibly can. Modern Times, from 1936, is his last major film to feature the tramp character, and it's also his most overtly political work up to that point, taking sharp aim at industrialization, mechanization, and the way factory labor was dehumanizing workers during the Great Depression. The film includes the iconic image of Chaplin's tramp literally caught inside the gears of a massive machine, a visual metaphor that's remained instantly recognizable for nearly a century since. Even here, dialogue remains almost entirely absent, aside from a nonsense song Chaplin performs near the film's end, his voice heard on screen for the very first time, but singing gibberish rather than actual words. One final act of defiance against the sound revolution that had already completely remade the rest of the industry around him. Finally, in 1940, Chaplin makes the definitive leap into fully spoken dialogue with The Great Dictator, and it's an extraordinarily bold choice of subject matter for the moment he chooses to do it. The film is a direct satirical attack on Adolf Hitler and Nazi fascism, with Chaplin playing dual roles, a persecuted Jewish barber and a bombastic dictator named Adenoid Hinkle, an obvious parody of Hitler himself, right down to a strikingly similar toothbrush mustache. The film is released before the United States has even entered World War II, at a time when isolationist sentiment still runs strong across the country, and when openly mocking Hitler on screen carries real professional and even physical risk. Chaplin later said that had he fully understood the true horror of the Nazi death camps while making the film, he wouldn't have been able to find the material funny enough to satirize. But at the time, the film stands as one of the earliest and most prominent pieces of American popular culture to directly confront and ridicule the rising fascist threat in Europe, and it becomes one of the biggest box office successes of his entire career. But the same fearlessness that made Chaplin willing to mock Hitler on screen also makes him deeply vulnerable as the political climate in America shifts after the war. Chaplin has always held openly left-leaning, humanitarian political views, and he's never been shy about expressing sympathy for progressive causes, opposition to the emerging Cold War, and skepticism toward American foreign policy. As the Red Scare and McCarthyism gripped the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Chaplin becomes a prime target, accused, without any real evidence, of harboring communist sympathies, subjected to FBI surveillance for years, and increasingly attacked in the conservative press as a dangerous, un-American subversive, despite the fact that he had lived and worked in the United States for nearly 4 decades without ever becoming a naturalized American citizen, choosing instead to retain his British nationality throughout. The breaking point comes in 1952. Chaplin boards a ship bound for England, planning to attend the London premiere of his new film Limelight, and take something of an extended European trip. While he's at sea, the United States Attorney General revokes his re-entry permit, effectively barring him from returning to the country where he had lived, worked, and built his entire career and fortune for close to 40 years, citing his political views and alleged moral behavior as grounds for exclusion. Rather than fight the ruling and subject himself to what he anticipated would be a hostile, humiliating hearing, Chaplin makes the decision not to return to the United States at all. He and his family settle instead in Switzerland, in a large estate near the shores of Lake Geneva, and Chaplin would not set foot in America again for 2 full decades. His personal life, meanwhile, had long been just as dramatic and controversial as his politics, arguably more so, at least in the eyes of the American tabloid press. He was married 4 times, and several of those relationships became major public scandals, largely because of the significant age gaps involved, and Chaplin's well-documented pattern of pursuing very young women, some of them teenagers, a pattern that drew intense scrutiny and criticism even by the standards of the era. His first marriage, to 16-year-old actress Mildred Harris in 1918, ends in divorce within a few years. His second marriage, to Lita Gray, also just 16 when their relationship began, and pregnant at the time they married in 1924, which was itself required to avoid Chaplin facing statutory criminal charges, ends in an extraordinarily bitter and highly publicized divorce that nearly bankrupts him and produces 2 sons, Charles Jr. and Sidney. His third marriage, to actress Paulette Goddard, who starred alongside him in both Modern Times and The Great Dictator is somewhat more stable, lasting through most of the 1930s before quietly dissolving. It's his fourth and final marriage that finally brings him lasting stability. In 1943, at 54 years old, Chaplin marries Una O'Neill, the 18-year-old daughter of the celebrated American playwright Eugene O'Neill. The age gap, 36 years, draws exactly the kind of public criticism you'd expect. And Eugene O'Neill himself is reportedly so opposed to the marriage that he disowns his daughter and never speaks to her again for the rest of his life. And yet, against every expectation the tabloids had for how quickly this marriage would collapse like his previous ones, Charlie and Una remain married for the rest of his life, 34 years, until his death, and have 8 children together. Una, by all accounts, becomes not just his wife but his closest creative confidant and the stabilizing center of his life during the most turbulent political period he ever faced, standing firmly by his side through the exile from America and the collapse of his public reputation in the country that had once adored him. Living in Switzerland through the 1950s and 1960s, Chaplin continues working, though at a slower pace, directing a handful of later films that never quite recapture the cultural dominance of his silent era peak. But as the political hysteria of the McCarthy era fades into history, and as film historians and new generations of critics begin properly reassessing his work as some of the most important and innovative filmmaking of the entire 20th century, American attitudes toward Chaplin gradually soften. In 1972, 20 years after his effective exile, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences invites him back to the United States to receive an honorary Academy Award, recognizing what the Academy calls the incalculable effect he has had in making motion pictures the art form of this century. Chaplin, by then 83 years old and visibly frail, returns to a Hollywood that has transformed almost beyond recognition since he last called it home. When he walks out onto the stage at the ceremony, the audience rises to its feet in a standing ovation that lasts a full 12 minutes, still, to this day, the longest ovation in the history of the Academy Awards, a stunning, emotional act of collective apology from an industry and a country that had once cast him out. 3 years later, in 1975, Queen Elizabeth II formally knights him, bestowing the title of Sir Charles Chaplin in recognition of his contributions to cinema. A final, formal acknowledgement from his home country that the poor boy from the workhouses of Walworth had become one of the most significant artists Britain had ever produced. Charlie Chaplin dies peacefully in his sleep on December 25, 1977, Christmas morning, at his home in Vevey, Switzerland at the age of 88. Even his death carries one final strange, almost cinematic twist. Several months later, in March 1978, his coffin is stolen from the cemetery by 2 men attempting to extort money from his widow, Una, in exchange for its return. The plot fails, the men are caught, and Chaplin's body is recovered and reburied, this time encased in a thick layer of reinforced concrete to prevent any repeat attempt, a strange and slightly absurd postscript to a life that had already contained more drama, scandal, tragedy, and triumph than almost any other figure in the history of entertainment. From a hungry child pushed onto a music hall stage to save his mother's performance, to an orphan shuffled between workhouses and asylums, to the creator of the most recognizable character in the history of cinema, to a filmmaking pioneer who resisted an entire industry's shift to sound out of sheer artistic conviction, to a political exile banished from the country that made him famous, to a knighted icon receiving the longest standing ovation in Oscar history. The story of Charlie Chaplin is, in the end, the story of a man who spent his entire life turning pain into laughter, and somehow, against every possible obstacle placed in front of him, became one of the most beloved and influential artists the world has ever known.